The night sky over the alien capital was not dark with stars. It was burning red with fire. Explosions rumbled across the city like rolling thunder. Towers that had stood for centuries trembled. Their bright crystal walls cracked and falling apart. The sound of weapons echoed across the streets, and screams of soldiers and citizens mixed into one great wave of chaos. Inside the palace, the Empress of the Zyari Empire stood on the marble balcony of her grand hall. Her tall form was wrapped in a robe of silver, her crown glowing faintly in the firelight. She had ruled with command and strength, and never before had she seen her capital brought so low. Her eyes, normally calm, now burned with anger and disbelief. She turned to her guards, 12 of the Empire's finest warriors, armored in shining black steel. Each carried an energy spear, trained since childhood to protect her with their lives. She expected them to hold strong. After all, the Empress was not just a ruler. She was the heart of the Empire. Without her, everything would collapse. But even the bravest can break. Another explosion shook the palace. A section of the outer wall collapsed and fire lit up the ceiling. Dust and smoke filled the air. Through the chaos, the sound of enemy war cries drew closer. An army had breached the palace gates. The Empress's voice cut through the noise, firm and steady. "Stand your ground. Protect your Empress. We will not fall tonight." But her words did not bring courage. Instead, fear crept into the hearts of her guards. They had seen the strength of the enemy, and they had seen their own forces fall apart like sand in the wind. One guard shouted, "The enemy is too many. We must retreat." Another dropped his weapon, his hands shaking. "We cannot hold them off. They will kill us all." The Empress stared in disbelief as her guards, her sworn protectors, backed away. She stepped forward, her silver robes dragging across the marble floor. "You dare?" she demanded. "You swore oaths before the throne. You are bound to me by honor." But fear was stronger than oaths. One by one, the guards turned. First 2, then 4, then all 12. They fled down the hall like frightened children, leaving behind their spears and shields. The Empress reached out her hand, but none of them returned. For the first time in her reign, she was left unguarded. The doors at the far end of the hall cracked as enemy soldiers pounded against them. The Empress stood alone, tall but vulnerable, the crown on her head shining faintly in the firelight. Her heart pounded, not with fear for herself, but with fury at betrayal. She had been abandoned, or so she thought. A voice spoke from the shadows near the broken pillars. "They may run, but I will not." The Empress turned sharply. From behind the smoke and rubble stepped a figure unlike the others. He was not tall and elegant like her people. His armor was simple, scratched from old battles, and his face carried scars of war. He was human, one of the few that had been allowed into her empire's army. His name was Daniel, though most aliens simply called him the human soldier. He was not born of noble blood, nor was he considered powerful among her kind. Many had looked down on him, believing humans to be fragile, short-lived creatures. Yet now, when all others had fled, he stood in front of her with his weapon in hand. "You," the Empress's voice was sharp, almost disbelieving. "Why are you here?" "Your unit was far from the palace." Daniel's eyes, steady and calm, met hers. "My unit is gone, but you're still here. Someone has to keep you alive." The pounding on the doors grew louder. The enemy was breaking through. The Empress narrowed her eyes. "You think one soldier can do what 12 could not?" Daniel gave a small, tired smile. "Maybe not, but I can try. And I don't run." The words struck her harder than the explosions outside. He did not bow, he did not beg. He simply stood, scarred and weary, and chose to shield her. The doors cracked open. Through the splintered wood, enemy shadows appeared, giant figures with glowing eyes, weapons ready to kill. The Empress felt the ground shake as the final lock broke and the doors burst inward. Daniel moved first. He stepped in front of her, his body the barrier between Empress and enemy. His weapon hummed to life, but even without it, his stance spoke louder than steel. He would not move. He would not flee. He would not let them touch her. The Empress, standing behind him, felt something strange stir in her chest. She had always commanded loyalty through fear or through law, but this human soldier was not bound by either. He stayed because he chose to. He stood because his heart told him to, and that made her wonder. Perhaps humans were not so weak after all. The hall filled with the roar of enemies as they rushed in, and the first clash of battle began. Daniel raised his weapon. fire and light flashing across the burning palace. The Empress, for the first time that night, felt hope. The great hall shook with violence, the massive doors burst open, splintering into pieces as enemy soldiers stormed inside. Their tall frames were covered in dark armor, eyes glowing with fury. They carried plasma rifles and blades that glowed blue in the firelight. They had come for the Empress, and nothing else would satisfy them. But between them and their target stood a single human soldier. Daniel raised his rifle and fired. Bolts of burning light cracked across the hall, striking the first two invaders. They fell, but more surged forward. The sound of weapons echoed like thunder, and smoke filled the chamber. The Empress watched from behind, her heart heavy with the weight of the moment. She had been left alone by her own guards, yet this one human stood firm. His stance was not perfect like her trained warriors, but his resolve was unshakable. Every shot, every movement was filled with determination. The enemies rushed closer. Daniel threw aside his rifle when its charge ran dry and drew his sidearm. He fired with precision, his body shielding hers even as plasma bolts tore chunks from the marble walls around them. "Stay close to me," he shouted over the chaos. The Empress clenched her fists. She was no helpless figure. She was Empress of the Zayari, and her blood carried centuries of strength. But in that moment she realized her power meant nothing without those willing to stand beside her. She obeyed his words. A plasma bolt struck the ground near Daniel's feet, throwing him back a step. He grimaced as another shot grazed his shoulder, burning through his armor. The smell of scorched fabric filled the air. Still, he did not fall. He gritted his teeth, pulled her behind a broken pillar, and reloaded with quick hands. His voice was firm, steady, almost calm. "We need to move. If they surround us here, we're finished." The Empress stared at him, disbelief in her eyes. "You're injured?" Daniel shook his head, sweat dripping down his face. "Doesn't matter. I can still fight, but we need to get you out of the palace." The sound of marching boots filled the corridor beyond. The enemy was pouring in from every side. Daniel led her through a side passage, guiding her quickly down smoke-filled halls. Statues of ancient rulers crumbled as explosions rocked the palace. Fires spread through silk banners and carved wooden beams. The Empress walked swiftly beside him, her long silver robes brushing against the broken stones. Her gaze kept returning to him. The burn on his shoulder, the blood on his arm, the dirt and smoke on his face. He should have collapsed by now. Yet he pushed forward without hesitation. Finally, her voice cut through the chaos. "Why are you doing this?" Daniel didn't look back. His rifle was raised, his steps firm. "Because it's the right thing to do." The Empress frowned. "The right thing? Your life is worth more than this risk." He gave a short laugh, though his tone was rough with exhaustion. "Maybe to you. But where I come from, you don't leave people behind. Doesn't matter if it's a friend, a stranger, or an Empress." Her chest tightened at his words. Loyalty without oath, bravery without command. Such things were rare among her people where power and fear ruled. Yet this man, a human outsider, gave it freely. They turned a corner, only to find another squad of enemy soldiers blocking the path. Their glowing blades lit the corridor as they advanced. Daniel pushed the Empress behind him. "Stay low." He charged forward with sudden force, firing until his rifle sparked empty again. He tossed it aside, drew his knife, and met the first soldier head-on. The alien warrior was larger, stronger, but Daniel moved with desperate speed. He ducked under a glowing blade and drove his knife into the gap of the enemy's armor. The soldier fell. Daniel ripped the blade from his grasp and swung it against the next attacker. Sparks flew as steel clashed. He moved with raw instinct, not the elegant training of her guards, but every strike was filled with stubborn will. The Empress watched in silence, her heart pounding. He fought like a man who refused to die, like a wall refusing to fall no matter how hard the storm struck. Another enemy slashed across his arm. Blood flowed freely, but Daniel didn't stop. He pressed forward, forcing them back with sheer determination. At last, the last enemy in the corridor collapsed. Daniel leaned against the wall, breathing hard. His body shook with pain, but he still raised his hand toward her. "We need to keep moving." The Empress hesitated. For the first time in her life, she felt uncertain, not of herself, but of him. She stepped forward, her eyes meeting his. "Why risk yourself so much? You owe me nothing." Daniel's lips curved into a faint, weary smile. "That's exactly why. Because if I don't, no one else will." The words struck her deeper than any blade. For centuries, she had believed loyalty came from duty, from fear, from the weight of command. But this human showed her something different, loyalty born of choice. And that choice made him stronger than an entire squad of trained guards. Before she could speak again, the sound of more soldiers echoed through the palace. They were closing in. Daniel steadied himself, ignoring the blood dripping from his arm. "Come on, I'll get you out." And once again he stepped in front of her, his body the shield that would not break. The palace groaned as if it were alive. Towers collapsed in the distance, and waves of smoke curled through the shattered halls. Every step Daniel took with the Empress beside him felt heavier than the last. His left arm bled freely, his shoulder burned with each movement, and his lungs filled with smoke. But he pressed forward. He had no choice. The Empress walked in silence for a while, her silver crown dim in the gloom. She watched him carefully, the way his steps slowed for only a breath before he forced himself forward, the way his eyes scanned every shadow even as his own body begged for rest. She could not understand it. At last she spoke, her voice soft but edged with curiosity. "You are in pain." Daniel gave a half-smile without turning his head. "Pain means I'm still alive. That's enough," she frowned. "You will fall if you keep this pace. Then what happens to your Empress?" Daniel glanced at her then, his eyes calm though his face was pale. "Then I crawl. Either way, I don't leave you." The Empress felt something stir inside her, a weight not of command but of gratitude. Yet she said nothing more. The sound of boots echoed from behind them. Enemy soldiers were closing in fast. Daniel looked around the corridor and spotted a weak archway overhead. The ancient stone had already cracked from the blasts. He motioned her forward. "Keep moving." "I'll slow them down," she raised a brow. "How?" "You can barely stand," Daniel smirked faintly. "Doesn't take much to knock down a ceiling." Before she could argue, he lifted a fallen spear from the floor, wedged it into the crack, and pulled with every ounce of strength. Stone groaned and dust rained down. The archway collapsed with a roar, sealing the corridor behind them in a wall of rubble. The Empress stared at him as dust settled on his burned armor. "You could have been buried alive." Daniel coughed through the smoke and gave a shrug. "Worth it if it buys us a few more minutes." They pressed on. Through twisting halls they moved, past fallen statues, burning banners, and shattered glass that once decorated the palace with pride. The Empress felt each step like a dagger in her heart. This was her home, the jewel of her empire now reduced to ash. And yet, amid the ruin, the human soldier never faltered. When another squad of enemies blocked their path ahead, Daniel pulled her behind a broken column. His breathing was heavy, but his eyes were sharp. "We can't fight them head-on," he whispered. The Empress tilted her head. "Then what do you suggest?" Daniel scanned the corridor. Nearby, a cracked fuel pipe leaked sparks. He nodded toward it. "We let the palace fight for us." He picked up a chunk of stone and hurled it toward the pipe. Sparks erupted into flame, racing down the hall. The enemy soldiers shouted as fire burst between them, forcing them back. Daniel grabbed her hand without thinking and pulled her down a side passage. The Empress felt the roughness of his grip, the heat of his skin even through smoke. For a moment she almost forgot she was Empress. She was simply a woman being guided by someone who refused to let her fall. They moved through a long corridor lined with mirrors, each cracked and blackened by flame. The Empress caught her reflection, dust-covered, crown crooked, silver robe torn. She hardly looked like an Empress anymore. But beside her, Daniel looked no more a soldier. He was something else entirely, a shield battered but unbroken. At the far end, the corridor split in two. Daniel paused, listening. One path echoed with heavy boots. The other was silent. He nodded toward the quiet one. "This way." The Empress studied him as they walked. "You act as though you know this palace as well as I do." Daniel shook his head. "I don't, but I know battles. I know how enemies move, and I know survival." "Survival?" she repeated softly, almost bitterly. "My guards chose survival over loyalty." "Yet you—" Her voice trailed off. Daniel stopped, leaning briefly against the wall as his legs trembled. His voice was low but firm. "Survival means nothing if it costs your soul. I'd rather stand and fall for something true than live by running away." The Empress's breath caught. She had heard thousands of speeches from generals and nobles, but none had ever struck her like these simple words. Before she could reply, a sudden blast shook the hall. Part of the ceiling collapsed, cutting off their path forward. They turned to retreat, but enemy soldiers poured in from behind, weapons raised. Daniel cursed under his breath. He shoved the Empress behind a fallen column. "Stay down." He lifted the glowing alien blade he had taken earlier. His hands shook, his body weakened, but his stance remained steady. The first soldier charged, towering over him. Daniel ducked the strike and drove the blade upward, cutting through armor. He staggered but turned to meet the next. The Empress peeked from behind the column. She saw his every move, clumsy at times, desperate but unstoppable. Each time a blade came near her, he stepped in front of it, taking blows meant for her. One strike cut deep across his side. He gasped, blood staining his armor, yet he still swung his weapon. Another enemy fell. The Empress rose from cover, her voice sharp. "You will die if you keep this madness." Daniel forced a grin through the pain. "Then I'll die standing, not running." Something inside her cracked at those words. She could not stay hidden while he bled for her. She picked up a fallen spear and stepped beside him. Daniel glanced at her in surprise. "You don't have to." Her eyes burned with fire. "I am your Empress. I will not hide behind your back like a coward." Together they struck. Daniel blocked blows with his shield, his body always moving between her and danger. She, though unused to real combat, thrust her spear with regal precision, driving back those who thought her weak. For a brief moment, human and Empress fought as one. At last, the final enemy in the corridor fell. Daniel staggered, his legs nearly giving way. The Empress caught his arm, steadying him. His face was pale, sweat dripping, but his eyes remained fierce. "Through there," she said, pointing to a cracked wall. She knew the palace better than any, and beyond that wall lay a hidden passage once used by her ancestors. Daniel nodded weakly. "Good. Then let's keep moving before more show up." With her support, he stumbled toward the wall. Together, they pushed aside the broken stones and slipped into the dark tunnel beyond. The Empress lit a faint glow from the crystal on her crown. The tunnel stretched downward, away from the burning palace. For the first time that night, they had a chance to breathe. Daniel sank against the wall, his chest heaving. Blood stained his armor, his face pale. Yet when he looked at her, there was no regret. "Only determination. You'll be safe here for a while," he whispered. The Empress knelt beside him, her eyes lingering on his wounds. She felt something she had never known before, a heavy ache in her chest. She spoke softly, almost to herself. "Why do you fight so hard for me? I'm nothing to you." Daniel looked at her then, his gaze steady. "Because you are everything to them." He nodded toward the city beyond the walls. "If you fall, hope falls. And I won't let that happen." The Empress's throat tightened. No oath, no order, no reward. Only choice. And it was stronger than all the guards who had fled. She realized then that she had not been abandoned after all. For in her darkest hour, a single human stood when all others ran, and that made him greater than an army. The hidden tunnel sloped downward, narrow and damp. Smoke from the burning palace still seeped through the cracks, mixing with the smell of blood and fire. Daniel leaned against the cool stone wall, every breath sharp with pain. His wounds burned. His muscles screamed, yet his eyes never left the dark corridor ahead. The Empress followed closely, her hand lightly brushing his arm to steady him when he faltered. She had begun to understand him, not just the soldier, but the human behind it. Every step he took was a choice. Every shield, every blow he endured, was deliberate. Not because duty demanded it, not because command ordered it, but because he chose to protect her. She could not say she had ever seen loyalty like this among her people. Suddenly, the faint sound of boots echoed from behind. The enemy had not given up. They were relentless. Daniel gritted his teeth. "They're close. We can't outrun them forever." The Empress's voice was steady, yet carried a note of worry. "Then we must fight. Here, where the tunnel narrows." Daniel's lips curved into a faint grin, even through the pain. "Exactly what I was thinking." They reached a point where the tunnel constricted into a narrow arch. The walls were jagged, and the ceiling low, forcing enemies to enter single file. Daniel sank to one knee, planting a brace of sharp metal spikes across the passage. He pulled the Empress down with him. "This is our choke point," he whispered. "We hold them here and we may survive." The Empress studied him, astonished. "You think a single human can stop them?" Daniel looked at her with sharp determination. "I don't know if I can stop them all, but I'll give them a reason to hesitate." The first soldier entered the narrow tunnel. Daniel braced himself, his armor battered, wounds open, yet his hands gripped his weapon with unwavering strength. The enemy rushed forward expecting an easy target. Instead, they met steel, force, and a human who refused to yield. Daniel struck with precision, despite the sharp pain that shot through his arm and side. Each movement was calculated. Push, parry, strike. The narrow corridor meant enemies could not surround him, and he used it to his advantage. The Empress watched in silent awe as he moved with instinct born of experience, not training like her elite guards, but a raw, unbroken will. Each enemy that fell was replaced by another, yet Daniel held the line. One soldier tried to flank him, but the narrow walls forced the attacker into the corridor's center. Daniel pivoted, using his remaining strength to drive the soldier backward into the spikes he had planted earlier. The enemy screamed and collapsed. The Empress's eyes widened. You are incredible." Daniel didn't respond. His focus was absolute. Another enemy rushed, slashing with a glowing blade. Daniel took the strike across his chest, gasping, yet still intercepted the next with his shield. Blood stained the floor, mixing with smoke and debris. "Stand back," Daniel shouted, voice hoarse. "I can handle this, just stay behind me." But the Empress refused. She had already seen his bravery. She would not hide while he bled for her. With her spear in hand, she thrust at the next soldier, forcing him back, giving Daniel a moment to recover. The two of them fought as one, human ingenuity and alien royalty, side by side. Time and again, Daniel stepped between her and danger, taking the blows she could not. Every slash of the blade, every plasma bolt was met by his unbroken will. The corridor shook as more enemies poured in. Daniel's strength began to waver. His vision blurred, pain stabbing through every limb. Yet he never faltered. Every time, a weapon aimed at her, he moved faster, braver, refusing to let them reach her. The Empress, despite herself, felt fear for the first time. Not for her own life, but for his. She realized then that her life had been entrusted to someone far greater than she had ever imagined. Finally, Daniel fell to one knee, exhausted, yet he raised his hand toward her. "Keep moving. Lead them to the exit. I'll cover you." She refused. "I am not leaving you." Daniel shook his head. "If we both fall here, nothing survives. Go, now." Tears stung her eyes, but she trusted him. Slowly she moved, past him, taking careful aim with her spear, knocking back any attacker that got too close. Daniel remained in the center, his shield raised, every ounce of his being focused on one thing: keeping her alive. The sound of more boots echoed from a distant hall. They were reinforcements, her loyal subjects, finally rallying to her call. They had seen the chaos, and one brave human had inspired them to rise again. The Empress's army had not completely abandoned her. It had needed a spark. Daniel noticed the approaching figures. He smiled weakly, pain etched across his face. About time. The Empress, now seeing soldiers stream into the corridor, felt a surge of relief. Together with the reinforcements, they pushed back the remaining enemies. Daniel, though wounded and exhausted, refused to step aside until the last foe was driven back. At last, the corridor fell silent. Smoke drifted through the stone halls, dust settled, and the Empress turned toward him. He was slumped against the wall, breathing heavily, blood seeping from his wounds. She approached, kneeling beside him, her hand on his shoulder. "You should have fallen long ago," she whispered. Daniel gave a faint, exhausted smile. Falling wasn't an option. She shook her head, eyes filled with emotion. "No, it wasn't. You saved me when everyone else ran. You showed me what humans are capable of." He coughed, blood staining his lips, yet his gaze remained steadfast. "I did what anyone should. You don't leave someone behind, even an Empress." The Empress felt something unfamiliar, gratitude mixed with awe, not just for the soldier who had shielded her, but for the courage, the honor, and the heart he had shown. In that moment, she knew the galaxy could underestimate humans no longer. One of them had stood when all others fled, and that act had turned despair into hope. She helped him to his feet. Slowly, painfully, he rose, leaning on her for support. "We need to get you out of here," he said, voice weak but resolute. The Empress nodded. "And the rest of the palace?" Daniel glanced back toward the burning ruins. "Let them take what they can. We'll save the rest another day. Right now, I protect you." She stared at him, her heart heavy with emotion. "Then I swear," she said softly, "you will never fight alone again. Not while I live, not while I rule." Daniel's lips curved into a tired but genuine smile. "Then I guess I'm in for a long life." Together, with the Empress leaning on him and the reinforcements forming a protective line behind, they moved toward the exit. The palace was still ablaze, and danger lurked around every corner, but they moved as one. For the first time that night, hope burned brighter than the fires that had destroyed their home, and at the heart of it all was a single human soldier, a man who refused to flee, refused to falter, and refused to let the Empress fall. In the end, he had not only protected her life, he had reminded her of the true strength of humanity, courage, loyalty, and choice. And that strength would change the galaxy forever. Daniel wiped the sweat from his forehead as the desert sun beat down on his damaged shuttle. He had been stranded on this barren world for 2 days, and the water purifier in his pack was already struggling to keep up. The ship's engines were gone, melted from an energy blast he hadn't even seen coming. And the transmitter, the only hope of sending a distress signal, was nothing but fried circuits. He had learned long ago that panic didn't help. He was an engineer, not a soldier, and he knew that survival meant one thing: keep fixing, keep moving, keep thinking. So he packed what tools he had left and set out across the cracked ground, scanning for anything that looked like metal, cables, or even the faint shadow of technology. By mid-afternoon, he found it. The alien structure rose from the earth like the skeleton of some forgotten giant. Tall black spires leaned against each other, half buried in sand. Strange glyphs shimmered faintly on the stone, glowing when his shadow passed over them. To most people, the place would look haunted. To Daniel, it looked like hope. He stepped inside carefully. The air was cooler, humming faintly with power. Broken devices lay scattered across the floor, machines of glass, metal, and crystal. His heart leapt. If he could study these, maybe he could repair his own transmitter. But he wasn't alone. A guttural voice echoed in the chamber. Daniel froze, turning slowly. Out of the shadows, tall figures appeared, their armor glinting in the faint light. Each carried a spear that buzzed with blue energy at the tip. Aliens. They were at least a head taller than him, their skin a pale shade of silver, their eyes glowing like molten gold. Their faces were sharp, beautiful but stern, like statues carved from stone. The leader barked something in their tongue. Daniel raised both hands slowly. "I don't want trouble," he said, his voice calm even though his heart raced. "I'm just looking for parts. My ship crashed." They didn't understand his words, but they understood his tools. The small spanner still clipped to his belt. One of the warriors lunged forward and snatched it, turning it over as if it were a treasure. The others murmured. Then, as if making a decision, they gestured for him to follow. Daniel weighed his choices. He could run, but they were faster. He could fight, but he would lose. So he nodded, slung his pack over his shoulder, and walked with them deeper into the ruins. The chamber they brought him to was larger, with high pillars and walls carved with more glowing glyphs. At the center sat a throne made not of stone but of interwoven crystal and metal. Upon it sat a figure unlike the others. She was tall like them, but her armor was lighter, elegant, shaped like flowing silver leaves. Her hair shimmered like strands of white fire, and her crown was not a band but a halo of shifting light. Her eyes, brighter than the rest, fixed on Daniel with an intensity that made him feel like a child standing before a storm. The warriors bowed. Daniel didn't, not because he was disrespectful, but because he wasn't sure if bowing was even the right gesture. Instead, he stood straight, tools clinking faintly in his pack. The woman spoke, her voice clear and commanding. The warriors replied quickly, pointing at him, then at his tools. She tilted her head, studying him. Then she raised one hand and the warriors fell silent. Daniel swallowed. "I'm guessing you're the one in charge." Her eyes narrowed. She gestured, and one of the warriors brought forward a broken device from the side of the chamber. It was a transmitter or something like it, its wires frayed, its crystal core cracked. She pointed at it. Then she pointed at him. Daniel understood instantly. "You want me to fix it," he said. The Queen, because that's what she had to be, gave the smallest nod. He knelt by the device, carefully unpacking his tools. The aliens watched in silence, their spears still buzzing faintly, ready to strike if he made a wrong move. His hands moved carefully, gently lifting each piece, studying it, testing the connections. It wasn't human technology, but engineering was universal. Circuits carried power, crystals focused energy, casings kept it stable. The language of machines was one Daniel knew better than the language of people. He tested a current, adjusted a connection, replaced a broken wire with one from his own pack. Slowly the device flickered with faint light. The aliens gasped. The Queen leaned forward on her throne, her golden eyes locked on the small glow. Daniel kept working, sweat dripping down his face. Hours passed, but he didn't stop. He couldn't. Not while his life, and maybe his only way home, depended on it. At last the device let out a soft hum. Not fully repaired, but alive. Daniel sat back, exhausted. "That's the best I can do for now." The warriors murmured among themselves, some in awe, some in suspicion. The Queen rose from her throne, stepping down with slow, graceful movements. She stood over him, tall and commanding, and placed one hand on the glowing device. It responded to her touch, light spreading across its surface. Then she looked down at him. Her voice was low, melodic, but filled with power. She said something in her tongue, words Daniel couldn't understand, but the tone was clear. She was acknowledging him. The warriors bowed again. This time Daniel didn't feel like just a prisoner. He felt like something more had just begun. That night he was given a small chamber in the ruins. Not a cell, but not freedom either. A guard stood outside the door, but no chains bound him. Daniel sat by the faint firelight, staring at his hands. He had only wanted to fix his transmitter, send a signal, and get rescued. But now, he had walked straight into the heart of an alien people, and their Queen herself was watching him closely. He lay down on the cold floor, listening to the faint hum of the machines around him. For the first time since the crash, he felt a strange spark of hope. He didn't know it yet, but this was only the beginning.